My name is Kathy Joseph. I'm an author and a YouTuber and from San Francisco. I've been writing for about 6 years and doing YouTube videos for about 5. And I write and make YouTube videos on the history of science and technical development, which is why my first book, The Lightning Tamers, is about how electricity was developed over time. What makes me unique as an author is that most historical scientists only write to entertain, which there's nothing wrong with that. But the reason I'm writing these books is to teach people about the science through its history. So for me, the unique, quirky stories are just there to help me get a sense of who they are and why they were doing what they were doing. The great thing about it is because my book is chronological, the scientific discoveries grow on each other. And because you know a bit about the people who are discovering these things, their discoveries mean more because they meant more to the scientists. And so you become invested in their discoveries. And then you get this feeling of you understand it, hopefully with very little effort. And I think the other good part about that is because I am trying to teach the science through the history, for people who already know the science, you won't have this irritating feeling of like they didn't treat it with very much depth, because I treat it with a lot of depth. But because it's chronological, if you come to the book with no knowledge, hopefully you will just feel great about it. So what inspired me to write The Lightning Tamers? Well, I would say my inspiration came on a specific day. I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago when I was having dinner and I was discussing with the people at the table what we did for a living, and I told them that I was a high school teacher in physics. And they were a little intimidated by the word physics. And they started asking me stories about it. And I told them that I had asked my students where electricity came from. And one student bravely raised her hand and then said it came from the wall. And I said, the wall? And she said, yeah, the wall with the plug in it. And I went, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. Technically, electricity does come from the wall. But I was hoping for something with a little bit more depth, and they couldn't get where it came from. And the woman I was talking to kind of chuckled, and she basically admitted that she also didn't know where electricity came from. And so I explained how electricity came into the home without the math. And she was shocked. She was delighted. She just loved knowing a little bit of how the world worked. And I thought, ding, there's other people like this in the world. Other people who would like to know how the world operates physics-wise and engineering-wise, but don't know where to start and feel intimidated by it. I thought, well, the best way to do this might be to make an historical book, to tell the story through the scientists who discovered it. So that's what I did. I just went to the beginning of the discovery of electricity and then did a path of how each person influenced the next person, influenced the next person, influenced the next person, and etc. And I fell in love with the history of science, and I became a huge believer that the best way to teach science for everyone, for the people who hate math, for the people who love math, is to tell a little bit about where it came from. It gives it so much more resonance and so much more meaning. That's a hard question to answer, but there are certain people that sort of pop out. One of the people that pops out for me is an author named Bill Bryson. Now, I've been a fan of Bill Bryson since I read his book on American language versus English language. I just thought it was fun and funny, and I loved his irreverent style he just falls down rabbit holes, and I love that. And then he wrote a book called A Short History of Nearly Everything, which was about telling sort of the stories of how we know things about the world. Like, how do we know the age of the Earth? How do we know the size of the Earth? How do we know these things? And it taught me that you could discuss the science through its history. And I found that very powerful. There's another author named David Bodanis, and he had heard this interview with an actress named Cameron Diaz, who said the one thing she wished she understood was E equals MC squared. So he wrote a book sort of explaining E equals MC squared through the histories of the scientists behind it. First, I found the personal stories fascinating, and second, I just fell in love with the idea of knowing where these things came from. And that was hugely influential for me writing my book. For me, the biggest challenge is finding the balance, because there's so many amazing stories and I'm so easily diverted that it is easy to get distracted and tell a story that doesn't really push the narrative along. In my mind, the narrative is always, how do I tell the story of how the science developed? So for me, it's a big challenge to figure out what to remove. And my solution to that has often been, when I have to remove a section because it just doesn't fit, I'm like, oh, I will just write a whole new book about that section, which is why this one book converted into, I think I'm up to 7 books. Yeah, 7 books, because it keeps on multiplying. I probably will have 100 books on my to-do list on my deathbed, because it keeps on multiplying. The other challenge I have is to balance the technical level, because I want the book to be readable for anyone. I want someone, if you can read, I want you to be able to read this book and understand it. I don't want to require any scientific knowledge ahead of time. But I also want to be able to describe the science in some depth, and I want to make sure I don't bore or irritate the people who already know the science. So for me, my biggest challenges are trying to make it concise enough and not a 3,000-page book, and also keeping the accuracy of the physics without losing the non-physics audience. Now, IngramSpark is a company that allows you to self-publish. So I'm going to answer the question slightly differently. I'm going to answer the question, what is it like to self-publish? And am I happy to have done it? And the answer is, it's great. It's a lot of work, but it's great. The reason I wanted to self-publish is because it turns out I'm a bit of a control freak. And by a bit, I mean a huge control freak. I had no idea that about myself, but yeah, that was one of the joys of YouTube. It's one of the joys of writing a book, is that I wanted to be able to control everything I did. Also, I have a very distinctive style that is slightly different from the usual, in that, one, I'm very informal. For example, in my book, each chapter starts with a paragraph from my point of view that says, hey, these are my opinions about this chapter. This is what I liked about it. This is what I didn't like about it. But I think a traditional publisher might be like, well, that's not how traditional books are written, so maybe not. Also, I incorporate this informal style with these fun stories with real science, with real depth. And as far as I can tell, nobody does that, which means that traditional publishers don't like doing something new. I had interest in them promoting my book and selling my book and formatting my book, but I had no interest in them telling me what to do. With IngramSpark, I can publish, and you can go to a library or a bookstore and say, I want this book, and you can get it just as if I published with a traditional publisher. So, am I happy that I chose self-publishing? Yes. And do I like IngramSpark? So far, yes.